And now I'm talking to Barry Grant from Problem Gambling Ireland. Barry, how's it going?
Good, thanks, Darren. Lovely to meet you.
Right. Barry, could you tell me a bit about your background first, please, and how you got involved in advocating against problem gambling?
Well, my own background is I'm an addiction counsellor. I'd been working in the field for a few years, and I started to notice more and more people presenting with gambling issues over time. And weirdly enough, when I was doing my degree in addiction counselling, we barely even touched on gambling as an addiction. All the focus was on substances, alcohol and other drugs. So I had to do a lot of research when I was working with these gambling clients to try and upskill. And the more research I did, the more I realised that there were very few dedicated services in Ireland, particularly on the prevention side and trying to raise awareness and get more people to seek help. So I left my job and I decided I'd set up the organisation. Started out just as me and a laptop and setting up a website and taking phone calls and emails and contacting social media and trying to help people as much as I could. Then we incorporated as a company. I have a board of directors there to support me now as well, and we're planning to expand the services nationwide and be able to provide more supports.
Are you working, are you the only full-time person working, or is there more? What's the story like?
Yeah, I'm the only employee at the moment, and I'm only part-time because we don't have funding, so I have to do my own counselling on the side to bring in funding.
A bookie's opened in the shopping centre in my parents' estate a few years ago. Can you tell me, is it my imagination that the problem of problem gambling has got worse in Ireland in the last couple or few years, or if the problem has remained the same for the last few years?
My opinion, and this is just kind of anecdotal evidence, is that the problem has worsened. If you talk to people who are attending regular Gamblers Anonymous meetings over the years, they would tell you the same thing. There are more and more people coming through, more younger people coming through, more women coming through, more people with online gambling problems coming through. The reality is we all carry around a smartphone this stage, 90% of us. So now we all have the ability to have bookmakers and casinos in our pocket 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that's a game changer. That's a paradigm shift. The old thing, of course, there were always people who developed gambling problems just in the traditional bookmakers, in the amusement arcades, the casinos, all that sort of thing. But what you've seen around the world is exponential growth since online gambling has come on the scene. In the UK, between June 2015 and June 2016, they saw a 75% increase in problem gambling rates. Now, we don't have figures for Ireland because the government haven't done any research into it, so we don't even know.
It's true to say, isn't it, that being addicted to gambling is actually foremost a public health matter, isn't it, or should be?
Absolutely, and in more progressive countries, in other jurisdictions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they are tackling it as a public health issue. They treat it like any other public health issue. If it's cigarette smoking, mental health, alcohol use, drug use, whatever it is. In Ireland, we're way behind the curve in terms of acknowledging that it is a public health issue.
I was talking to Carol Moore from Dual Diagnosis Ireland recently. I don't know if you know her, yeah? But there's some committee that was established only recently for dual diagnosis problems, people with dual mental health and addiction problems. And I was talking to her last week, and she came back to me a couple of days ago, and she says gambling is included on it, so that's a good development, isn't it?
Absolutely, it definitely should be. If you look at the statistics on people with gambling problems around the world, about 70% will have depression along with their gambling problem. There's a huge dual diagnosis with alcohol problems as well, with anxiety, with suicidal ideation. And Dual Diagnosis Ireland do amazing work, and I would support them 100%. And this is something that in my own practice as a counsellor that has been concerning me for a long time, that the services in Ireland are either mental health or addictions. Now, if you look at the population of people with any kind of an addiction, the vast majority of them have dual diagnosis, coexisting mental health issues. So we have to have dual diagnosis services for people with gambling problems, alcohol problems, and other forms of addiction.
In particular, I think as regards being so much troublesome or dangerous, there's a very high comorbid rate with alcohol, isn't there?
Absolutely. Some studies would show about 70% coexisting or comorbid conditions there with alcohol abuse or misuse. And of course, sometimes it can be the chicken or the egg. You're drinking too much, so you gamble too much, or it could be because you're gambling so much, your mood is low, you've lost a lot of money, so you start drinking too much. So I mean, those things very often, more often than not, exist together.
Yeah, and of course, bookies are usually established beside pubs, like.
Yeah, I mean, that's an absolute disaster, but I mean, you can see why bookmakers and pubs would do that. There's a symbiosis there. I worked in pubs for a long time, and in the old days before online gambling, people were nipping in and out the whole time to do their bets.
How pervasive is the marketing of gambling in Ireland in your view, Barry? And could you tell me what you would like to see happen in Ireland so that we can really get on top of the problem gambling?
Marketing is just relentless here. I mean, we're seeing a race to the bottom in terms of marketing and advertising. In Ireland, we have no gambling regulator, so there's nobody there to do anything about it. I mean, the National Lottery must be the biggest advertiser in the state. Then you have the other big boys like Paddy Power, BuzzSports and so on. I was watching the Ireland games the other night, and Paddy Power banner kept on popping up. Half the kids in the country would have been watching those matches. So I mean, what I would like to see is a total separation of gambling, advertising and sponsorship from sport. I mean, sport is something that is a healthy activity that's supposed to be a protective factor against mental health issues, against addictions, and the gambling industry have worked very hard to insinuate themselves into the sporting world. I mean, the Premier League teams at the moment, 10 of the 20 have a gambling sponsor. And that embeds itself in young minds, it embeds itself in vulnerable minds. So if your team is sponsored by Bet365, you might be more likely to have brand loyalty to that brand, for example. And of course, that's why the gambling industry do it. So we need much greater restrictions. We need a watershed control in terms of gambling advertising, so there should be no gambling advertising during the pre-watershed hours when children might be exposed to it. That would be a great starting point. And also no inducements or incentives, so in other words, no free bets. Free bets are absolutely diabolical. They should not be allowed. And I've worked with quite a few people who've been in recovery from their gambling addiction, who've had slips or full relapses because they've seen free bet offers and gone on, created new accounts, put their tenner in and got their free bets, and then they were back down the slippery slope.
I think with the public health alcohol bill, when it becomes an act, it's envisaged, I think it's 8 p.m. There's not going to be advertising allowed before 8 p.m. Would you kind of concur it should be the same for gambling?
Yeah, absolutely. We need that pre-watershed. I mean, I listen to a lot
Any particular time?
8 p.m. seems to be the standard one around the world. They've done something similar in Australia. They've also banned in-play or in-match advertising, so during a sports event, even if the gambling that's being advertised relates to that specific sports event, they've banned that as well in Australia. And Australia are the world's biggest gamblers. They're in first place, we're in third place. So and that's on a per capita basis. So the difference between us and Australia is they've acknowledged that they have a huge gambling problem and they've put the resources in place to try and deal with it. We have not acknowledged that we're the biggest gamblers in Europe, third biggest in the world, but we don't have the resources to deal with it.
So as regards sports, do you think gambling and sports should be totally separate? Like, should be no gambling allowed in sports, like as regards sponsorship of teams or anything like that?
Ideally, that's what I'd like to see. Now, I can understand from the perspective of the individual teams or the sporting bodies like the FAI or GAA or others that then they have to go about the business of finding another sponsor who's willing to pay as much as the gambling industry were paying. And of course that's problematic, but it's not impossible to do that. There are other huge corporations out there who would be more than happy to be associated with those sports.
I've heard some talk about a bill planned to go through the Oireachtas to regulate gambling in Ireland. Can you tell me if this is going to happen, do you think?
I'm hopeful that it's going to happen. I've met with representatives of the Department of Justice around this time last year. They advised me that they were working on it and they'd hope to have it enacted this year. I don't think that's going to happen, but I am hopeful. You know, we're trying to get cross-party support. Fianna Fáil seem to be behind it, Social Democrats, Sinn Féin, Labour, to the best of my knowledge. So, I mean, there seems to be cross-party support there to get it done. But I suppose issues like the housing crisis, Brexit, and other things are getting prioritised over that. Even the public health alcohol bill, which is extremely important as well. So, on the one hand, I would love to see it done today. On the other hand, we have to be realistic about how the system works, but it needs to happen as soon as humanly possible. I think it is going to happen. I think enough people have raised the issue, have raised concerns about the fact that it's been sitting on a shelf since 2013. So I'm hopeful that we might see it in 2018.
What happened in 2013?
In 2013, Alan Shatter, the then Minister for Justice, produced the heads of the Gambling Control Bill. Now, the Gambling Control Bill is, it's an excellent piece of legislation. It could be enacted in the morning and then amended as needed. I mean, certainly from our own perspective, a Problem Gambling Ireland, we could take it as it is, warts and all, and it would be an astronomical improvement on what we currently have. At the moment, we have gaming legislation for casinos from 1956, and we have gambling, so betting, sports betting legislation from the 1930s. So I mean, this is absolutely crazy. So we need some form of legislation put in as soon as possible, and also the bill would create the office of a gambling regulator who would be able to monitor the actions and the behaviours of the gambling industry.
I know over the years there's been a tendency among some governments in Ireland when they're trying to regulate something to bring in like a voluntary code for the business sector, whatever sector they're talking about. Like, I think that would be a bit of a disaster, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the gambling industry would claim that they have a voluntary code in place at the moment, and it sure as hell ain't working out very well for the people who are developing serious gambling problems. So a voluntary code will not wash. We need a regulator in there who's going to crack the whip, like they have in the UK. Recently fined 888 about £7.5 million for breaches of the rules over there. So we need a regulator with teeth who's going to ensure that all of the gambling operators behave responsibly. At the moment we have a race to the bottom where they all appear to be outdoing each other, trying to do anything to increase market share, and if we have a regulator there, it should level the playing field where everybody's playing by the same rules.
You're saying that we're the biggest gamblers in Europe. Where's the UK?
They're about, I think, 4 or 5 places below us.
And they have a regulator, yeah?
They have a regulator, absolutely.
But it's not affecting them in sports, is it? In soccer, like. In
terms of
the Premiership, it doesn't. The Premiership sports doesn't come underneath it, doesn't it?
No, sport wouldn't come under the gambling regulator. But I mean, in the UK, their football association recently ended their sponsorship deal with Ladbrokes that has been there for a long time. So the pressure is coming on. I think the public sentiment is turning against the gambling industry in the UK, and the changes are starting to happen there. I think sentiment here in Ireland is turning against some of the behaviours of the gambling industry as well, and the harm that's being caused by gambling. And I think a lot of people will be happy to see some separation there between gambling and sport. Sport is sport. It's a healthy activity that people can engage in, or that they can watch, and get enjoyment from without necessarily having to gamble on it. Of course, people can gamble on it if they want, but if gambling is completely embedded in sport, if it's enmeshed with sport, then the lines become very, very blurred.
Yeah, I was reading there a city council over in Ballyfermot was going mad recently because they got in Ballyfermot there was a new bookies open. They have like 4 or 5 bookies in Ballyfermot, more than anywhere else, any other area in town. Did you hear about that? Did you?
I didn't come across that one, but I mean this is a common issue that you would see in the UK and in other parts of Ireland, where areas that might be considered to be socially deprived have a greater incidence of bookmaker shops and casinos and things like this than more sort of middle class areas. And you see this certainly in the UK, where poorer areas, say in London or any of the other bigger cities, there's just bookmaker after bookmaker after bookmaker, and people have made the observation that the bookmakers might be preying on people who have very limited income and see gambling as a way to get themselves out of their financial difficulties. Of course, that is not the case. You know what I mean? That's not a realistic possibility, and of course people get themselves into all sorts of problems through that.
Just before I met you here a few minutes ago, you were at a meeting organised by Maureen O'Sullivan, TD, the TD for Dublin Central. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, Maureen was on the panel along with myself. It was actually organised by a new organisation called Tackle Gambling Ads. So they're a grassroots organisation headed by some students from DCU who are campaigning to reduce the impact of gambling advertising in Ireland. So some of the stuff that we talked about earlier on, and it's great to see that, because advertising is one of the things that concerns us at Problem Gambling Ireland, but it can't be our main focus, so we don't have the time and the resources to focus specifically on that issue. And it's great to see a new organisation there who are going to do a lot of work in that area, and obviously we're going to collaborate with them as much as we can. So no, the event was excellent. It was great to meet Maureen O'Sullivan. She's done a huge amount of work in the area of addiction, particularly in Dublin city centre, and she had a lot of very insightful things to say. She's been pushing the government to try and get the Gambling Control Bill enacted. So yeah, it was great to meet with her and to meet with the people from Tackle Gambling Ads as well.
I used to have a drink problem, I'm off it over 7 years, and I went to loads of AA meetings over the years. I haven't gone in a few years, I don't really go to AA anymore, but I went to a couple of hundred meetings over the years. And in AA, you hear it frequently said during meetings, and it's something that the writer Eckhart Tolle talks about as well. Like, a lot of the people's behaviour when they're drunk is this is the word AA use, insane. Like, it strikes me that, like, it's probably the case with all the serious addictions. If you're gambling, if you haven't got much money and you have to pay the bills, and you're risking that money by gambling, it just seems to me to be insane. Do you think so?
Of course, any sort of self-destructive behaviour, whether it's alcohol abuse or drug abuse or gambling abuse, is a form of insanity, because if we were in our right mind, we would never do that. So I mean, absolutely, it's a fair point. And when I'm working with people and they're looking back at how they were behaving before they got into recovery, they find it hard to believe they were doing what they were doing. I think when we all have the capacity to do that in different areas in our lives, whether it's with food or alcohol or drugs or gambling or whatever, and that when we get into a good place, then we realise how insane the whole process was.
You're living in Waterford, I know. If any of our listeners want to get in touch with you, can you give us your contact details, maybe the contact details of any other resources about problem gambling, like Gamblers Anonymous, whatever?
Yeah, anybody listening who wants to get in contact, whether they have a gambling problem themselves or if they're concerned about a family member or a friend, they can first of all check out the website. There's a lot of information on there. That's problemgambling.ie, or they can email me on info@problemgambling.ie, or you can call me on 089 241 5401. Now that's a callback service, because sometimes I'm working with clients, so as soon as I get your message, if I'm not available at the time, I'll call you back straight away. There are other great services out there, Gamblers Anonymous meetings all around the country. 7 days a week you can go to meetings. If you go to gamblersanonymous.ie, and also for family members or friends of people with gambling problems, there are GamAnon meetings, and details of those meetings are also on the Gamblers Anonymous website. Also, the RISE Foundation, set up by Senator Francis Black, provides a support service for family members who have a family member with any kind of an addiction, including gambling.
Just to finish up now, Barry, if any of our listeners have a gambling problem, they live in Dublin, the station we're on now is Near FM for Dublin. Is gambling? I know you're based in Waterford. Is Gamblers Anonymous the only place they can kind of go to in Dublin?
Well, for meetings it will be an option. I mean, there's Chochwira on Gardner Street. They have daily meetings there, and that's part of the Cúnmara addiction treatment group.
Is that Gamblers Anonymous?
They will be Gamblers Anonymous meetings. There's another type of meeting called Smart Recovery. If you go to the Smart Recovery website, I think there's an Irish one now, smartrecovery.ie, but if not, you could go to smartrecovery.co.uk and they'll have the list of the Irish meetings. But they don't specifically deal with gambling, they deal with all forms of addiction. Of course, there are residential treatment centres in Dublin like the Rutland and others. And then there are counsellors in the Dublin area. Actually, the Dunlewy service, they're based in Northern Ireland, but they have a panel of addiction counsellors around Ireland. So there will be addiction counsellors in Dublin, and they would provide, I think it's up to 12 free sessions of counselling specifically for people with gambling problems, and you can get their details on dunlewy.net for anybody in the Dublin area.
Okay, Barry, it's great talking to you. I'll be talking to you again hopefully next year, presumably when this bill is planned to go through the Iraq. This is about to regulate gambling. So thanks very much, Barry. Right?
Thanks, Darren. I hope it is next year when I'm talking to you about it. Thanks very